the leukocyte to the site of injury in order to eliminate the offending agent. And this involves the recruitment of leukocytes from the blood into the extravascular tissue. The recognition of microbes, once they're there, they need to be able to recognize microbes and to be able to remove the offending agent. And we talked about it, remember? Okay, we talked about all the recognition receptors, which is why I'm not going to cover it now. But this is when it happens. So the endothelial, I'm trying to put it tied together in your brain. So endothelial cells, they respond to the cytokines and to the other mediators. They contract. They enable the exit of leukocytes, and we discussed also a lot of the adhesion molecules that are involved. Remember, they roll, and then they adhere, and then they get out. And then they need to be able to recognize the pathogen or the tissue damage. Just a reminder, because we talked about it in immunology, we had this, first of all, we had the selectins, we had the P and E selectins that are expressed on endothelial cells, and then we had their ligand on leukocytes, and then there was, so this enabled the rolling, and then there was firm adhesion that was mediated by integrins, enabling the exit of the immune cells. And we said that which cytokines cause upregulation of adhesion molecules on endothelial cells? IL-8 is a chemokine, and what it does, it enables the affinity change of integrins. Okay, so this is IL-8. The pink stuff is IL-8. But before that, before we have the firm adhesion and the integrins that move into the high affinity state, we want, just for the rolling, we need the endothelial cells to express P-selectin and E-selectin. And that is upregulated by the activity of?
One.
Yeah, it's right here. Usually I ask you stuff that's on the IL-1 and TNF, the two major cytokines of acute inflammation. Okay? So, we talked about recognition, and for that we have specific receptors. The recognition causes further activation of leukocytes and also further production of more chemokines and cytokines. So we have the amplification. So we talked about, in immunology, about the pattern recognition receptors and about the pathogen-associated molecular patterns. We said that in the innate immune system, there's recognition of patterns rather than specific epitopes. Now you already had acquired immunity, right? So you know what I'm talking about. Again, just reminding you of the different receptors. So we had different kinds. This is just a summary slide to all the different kinds of receptors that we talked about. Some of the receptors are phagocytic receptors, and once they bind their ligand, they will cause phagocytosis, and also production of killing mediators such as reactive oxygen species. Some of the there's cytokine receptors that will recognize cytokines and activate more production of cytokines. There's toll-like receptors that recognize, for example, LPS. So they recognize specific patterns of pathogens. And there's a large family of 7 transmembrane G protein-coupled receptors that will activate chemotaxis and also cause the change in the integrins that enable adhesion. So this is the net results of all these receptors. Yes?
Can you just repeat the difference between cytokines and chemokines?
I didn't hear the first 2 words.
Can you just repeat the difference between the two?
So the definition of cytokine, we talked about in immunology. The definition of cytokine is a molecule that is secreted from one cell, causing a change in the function or behavior of another cell. Okay? And within this family of cytokines, which is a huge family,
chemokine is about the chemotaxis.
chemokines are cytokines that cause chemotaxis.
Oh, okay.
Okay? They're usually smaller molecules. And another difference is that cytokines they're receptor specific. So in order for a cell to respond to TNF, it will only respond if it has the TNF receptor. But chemokines, there's a lot of promiscuity in the receptors. So one receptor will recognize 3 different chemokines, and one chemokine can bind to 3 different chemokine receptors. See, they're not in the same family. So chemokine receptors are here. They're G-protein coupled receptors, and cytokine receptors just have their own shape. They're different. They're all different. Okay. Again, mentioning that leukocytes can actually. Are we doing a break or not?
Yes.
Yeah.
Wait. Ooh. Very definitive. So we started at 1:30, so we'll do the break at 15, right?
Yeah.
So leukocytes can cause injury, and so this is the collateral damage of inflammation, and this is why inflammation has to be very closely regulated. Because once leukocytes are activated, they basically do not distinguish between the offender and the host. So we said that already, that the most important initiators of acute inflammation are the resident cells, the tissue macrophages, or the mast cells. They're the first 2, the sentinel cells that can rapidly recognize the stimulus and initiate the response. I'm not going to go back into that because we talked about all the different leukocytes in immunology. Just to mention that the most important resident ones are mast cells, and they react to physical trauma, and they produce histamine, but also a lot of cytokines, including TNF and IL-1, which will start the reaction of the endothelial cells. Macrophages can recognize microbial products, and they secrete basically most of the cytokines and mediators of inflammation we can think of.
So they both secrete IL-1 and TNF.
Yes. The unique thing about mast cells is that they have histamine in their granules, and they can do this really quickly. They degranulate, so this can happen in minutes. Yes.
How exactly does inflammation, prolonged inflammation, cause tissue injury, like your own tissues?
Well, that's because part of what happens during inflammation is, for example, the release of reactive oxygen species, which can cause tissue damage. There's a lot of cell death and a lot of debris, and the vasculature is not activated, is not properly working. There's some ischemia. A lot of the contents in the vesicles of neutrophils and macrophages that are cytotoxic to pathogens can also kill host cells.
I thought those cytotoxic substances were very specific for the microbe, no?
So in principle, they are in the lysosomes and they're contained so they don't hurt anyone else. But then after the macrophage or the neutrophil did their job, they die.
And they release everything?
And a lot of it is just released. It just becomes a very messy soup containing a lot of cytotoxic substances. Sometimes I use words. Okay, so this is all mediated by different inflammatory mediators. There's over 180 mediators that are produced during inflammation. Some of them are plasma-derived, and some of them are cell-derived. Example for cell-derived mediators. We just said
IL-1.
yeah, cytokines and chemokines are cell-derived. Plasma-derived mediators,
Complement.
for example. Okay, so indeed, plasma-derived mediators are the complement system. The kinin cascade, which we're going to talk about, it gives rise to bradykinin, one of the major mediators of increased permeability, and clotting system proteins that are also part of inflammation. So, yeah, we're going to talk about this, and then I'll let you have a break. So this is the kinin cascade. You don't need to memorize it. What I want you to know is that it gives rise to bradykinin, which is an important mediator, inflammatory mediator, because it's very potent in increasing vascular permeability. I just want you to see how tightly things are regulated, okay? So bradykinin is produced from its precursor, HMWK, from the precursor, by the act of the enzyme kallikrein. But kallikrein is also inactive normally. It needs to be produced from its own precursor. And the factor that starts all this, which is factor 12, which is in the blood, also needs to be activated in order to work. So we have here 3 different levels of regulation before bradykinin, active bradykinin, is produced. Why is it so important to have all these regulations?
They can control it?
Yeah, it's very important to control inflammation because once these mediators are released, they can cause a lot of damage. So we want everything to be very controlled. And after bradykinin is produced, it's degraded a few minutes later by another enzyme. So it has a short half-life, which is another level of regulation. And this whole cascade cross-talks to the clotting cascade, to the complement, and to the fibrinolytic system. So there's a lot of overlap and a lot of crosstalk between different pathways of inflammation. Again, the take-home message here is the production of bradykinin and its role, but I want you to remember how this is well regulated.
Quick question.
Yes.
On that diagram. Maybe I'm misreading it. It looks like kallikrein. Is that pronounced properly?
Yeah, I wouldn't know how to. I never heard anyone say it except me.
Is there a positive feedback? I know we talked not about how there's so little positive feedback in the human body, but it seems to influence the production of 12.
Exactly. So there's also positive feedback. There's amplification and not just control.
So once you start this process, you're going to get more of it.
Yes. But
that sounds dangerous, no?
Yes, inflammation is very dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
So once you start this process, you're going to get more because this factor is going to be more. There's going to be more of factor 12 that is activated.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The precursor of bradykinin, I didn't want to complicate things, but the precursor of bradykinin, the HMWK, high molecular weight kallikrein,
okay,
is also a cofactor of this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so yes, there is amplification, but there's also an enzyme that degrades bradykinin.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is what we just said. This is just summarizing what happens here. Bradykinin increases vascular permeability, causes contraction of smooth muscle cells, dilation of blood vessel, and also it mediates pain, another feature of inflammation. So let's take a break now, and I really ask you to be seated at 2:30, okay? Because we have a lot of stuff to go over. Yeah. Yeah. Right? Is what? Oh. But in the PowerPoint itself, you can show you have iPad.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, totally.
Gosh, can I
Part of your spot.
to give everyone they don't compute that? Right? Really? Oh, really? Yeah. It's like very
Yeah, I think one of
So
my
I should
students.
do it.
I know, it's bizarre. There's nothing you haven't heard about it. Yeah, but just wait. He's going to
He looks mature already. He looks mature already.
She's a resident.
Oh, it's not great. For about,
Can I just see that's the elevation of the
Then you like really stand a chance of feeling afterwards.
Some companies prefer not to move their production. They're working another one in 4 weeks and another one in 6 weeks. Then they get kids ready to yeah.
If not, then we have it in the car.
So just what are some other key things to So I got me I used to work for Nauseous. I know that like doctors for information.
What do they do?
Yeah.
So actually, it's surprising how little people participate they are defined to chromatin, and then so that's how it's clearing of dead cells. It's chromatin allows dead cells. They're part. I think they're part of the.
For a lot of like computer applications.
Surprising going to Roberts. It's surprising how much that, but then the damage caused by them. There's also they cause the increase in the sedimentation rate of red blood cells. Right, so that's like a sign of inflammation, is like the sedimentation rate. So that's like a side effect, it's not a drug. I think otherwise they wouldn't be designed or evolved or something. They must have a purpose. I mean, once there's inflammation, they're produced in massive amounts. It's like liver release but what I think, but not a lot. All that I read.
That's why I went to medical school.
We gotta like sit down and really see.
Yeah, okay.
All my undergrad was like what my
It's like lots of
so funny and sad. So funny.
Also, this is good.
She was like, oh, I want to go
It's not physical or emotional showing. It's just physical. No emotion.
I don't
Oh,
Research? I don't know. I
I'm
couldn't.
repelled,
Only went
I
for
would say. Oh, ow.
Hey, you ate anything? You
Sure.
Yeah,
They are.
injury. Maybe Laura.
how does that sound?
Yeah,
How does it
we
start?
have people, yeah.
The attitude sound.
Who's calling? Yeah. 6 hours.
Wait, during the gay parade?
6.
Oh,
yeah.
What time is the gay parade at?
It's 3.
Where?
Where
What
does
time
it
is
start?
it? 9:30?
Yeah.
How are you
You
gonna
know what? They only have to take-
Apparently 12. I thought
they
it
only have to take 18.
I
They
know.
have to be 20.
Wait.
Where are you going for your
We're going to Independence Hall, so like, I'm pretty sure we've all, well, it's like a prime birthday activity.
Apparently
And
it's
then we're
on
like,
us.
to walk around town.
No, we did this before. We
That's where I wanna go.
Good luck.
We've been to United Street. I think that's what we're doing. It's like,
Maybe help me
we're
there.
all moving downtown next year.
It was fun.
You need to shower. Yeah.
It's just really nice to do it.
He said lick it.
Yeah, but that is
Lick it.
it was
But it was in a weird way.
It's
So fun. It's really weird.
Will you walk?
We ran
Brian is a much better friend than you guys.
out.
He supports my unpopular.
You can say the word
Two slides left.
You're not No, Wicked is the Wicked is the East Coast version of
Oh.
Oh, it's not.
No one here says lick it. But no one says lick it in New York. Okay, that's not.
I feel like it's a bummer.
That was on the East Coast.
Let's take a sample. Eddie.
He's New York now.
What?
We're
Oh, what's not? Oh, it's the Boston internet.
Oh.
You're wicked cool.
Miriam, do you ever say wicked cool?
I don't like fire. It's
I
not
couldn't even
What, you see that in San Francisco?
No, it's an East Coast thing.
No,
I feel like
it's
it's
not
very
even
like,
New
in like when we were like kids and like watching like Coast,
Super LA.
Disney Channel, like
No,
maybe
you
LA.
guys-
I think it would be like
Charles.
and it's like
Most people, so.
yeah, I don't know, but like
It's
it's
Charles.
Day.
So funny.
That's Charles Court.
It's a New England thing. Yeah.
It's right, well, it's
South.
it's right there.
Wait,
It's
Mike,
like
if
the
you're
whole
coming now?
I'm gonna say
Is it
yes.
mandatory?
It's, nothing's ever mandatory.
That's
We're
the
gonna
same thing. Nothing is
Like
We're gonna have fun.
Mandatory? It's highly recommended.
I can't believe we're only taking classes.
Hey.
They're gonna say Andy that I'm eating more watermelon.
No, it's so bad for you.
I'm sorry,
She told you it was bad.
I'm addicted to watermelons.
Yeah.
She's trying to tell you not to.
They told me I can't eat watermelons too sugary.
What?
Maybe that's a subtle way for you to use.
That's not so subtle way. You're telling me that. That's what it is. I'm very self-conscious. Adidas, vamos a. Is that good for the baby?
It's so good for the baby. So allergic to peanuts.
Of course, it's gonna make the baby not allergic to seeds.
But he has stated.
That's why there's no allergies to peanuts in Israel. Like,
All pregnant women.
well, almost none.
Well. Israelis do it so good. Oh,
I don't know.
I don't know if that's true. There's definitely less.
Wait,
Yeah.
really interesting. Like, if your parents like tell you something while you're like during pregnancy, you realize that you're
No, it's not a pregnancy. It's because
like if you're exposed to it later on, but isn't there still a genetic component to it that even if you're exposed,
yeah,
you're gonna get a
there
certain-
are people that are allergic to peanuts in Israel as well, but the percentages of peanut allergy in Israel are much smaller than they are in the US or Canada, and it was just a study, like a big study about it, and it wasn't done.
So I guess that's about because I know the percentage where it's so much less. And like how old to not to like I would like whatever, but like
So it's very
is that really because everyone's exposed to it earlier, or is that like a nice theory, but like there's another reason?
I don't know. You know, Americans eat peanut butter, so British don't really eat, so. I don't know. That was a study, and it wasn't just a Scientific American. It was an actual study.
No, I believe that.
Is it true? It's a study, and these were their conclusions.
Okay, so what I'm asking is was it a correlation, or was it like
was there something positive in the, I didn't read the actual study. It's a good question.
Very different. Actually, this morning, my cousin's mother was making samna, which is it's like Indian ghee with butter, except it's made with the smoke of wood. So she has this stick on fire in the kitchen. She's capturing the smoke in a bottle and putting the butter in it. The whole house smells amazing.
All right, guys. Let's talk about some cell-derived mediators. Some of them are preformed, such as histamine or serotonin that are formed before and they're stored in granules. Neutrophils also have a lot of their goodies stored in granules. The primary source of histamine are mast cells, but also platelets and basophils. So it's not produced by, for example, neutrophils or macrophages. Other cell-derived mediators are synthesized
synthesized after a stimulation. So their synthesis only begins after there's been an inflammatory stimulus. For example, cytokines and chemokines, which we talked about, platelet activating factor, which we're going to mention in a minute, and also arachidonic acid derivatives, which we talked about in immunology, such as cyclooxygenase and lipooxygenase. These are the enzymes that produce the prostaglandins and the leukotrienes, but also oxygen radicals and nitrogen oxide. So histamine, like we said, is present in the granules of mast cells. It's released by degranulation in response to physical injury, binding of antibodies to mast cells. They have IgE receptors, but also in response to fragments of complement, different cytokines, and substance P. It's the principal mediator, it's the main mediator of the immediate phase of the increased vascular permeability. Later, it's joined by other mediators that are not preformed. Arachidonic acid metabolites, we're just going to kind of mention them. We did this in more detail in immunology. They cause a lot of the hallmarks of inflammation. They mediate vasodilation, increased vascular permeability, pain, fever, and activation of neutrophils and other immune cells. And we talked about this. Just a reminder to their production. So there's production from phospholipids from the cell membrane by phospholipase that produces arachidonic acid, which can turn via cyclooxygenase to different prostaglandins, or via lipooxygenases to leukotrienes and lipoxins. Who remembers what lipoxins do? They're actually inhibitors of inflammation. So unlike leukotrienes and prostaglandins, they're inhibitors, and they're produced later on as a mechanism of regulation of inflammation. We also mentioned the fact that when we try to inhibit inflammation by like with using drugs, we can either interfere here with inhibitors of the activity of cyclooxygenase, inhibitors of COX-1 and COX-2, for example, aspirin, exactly. All the non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs, ibuprofen, and Advil, all these, they actually inhibit both COX-1 and COX-2. They have side effects, and now we have specific COX-1 inhibitors that have less side effects. For example, I think I gave you our COX as an example, and you didn't know it, so it may be, maybe it has a different name. But okay. Or we could go to inhibition that is more upstream and use steroids, which inhibit here. And we try only to do that only if we have to, because steroids also are very pleiotropic, and this will have a lot of side effects. Yes?
When will we have to? When will we have to inhibit phospholipase? When can't we just inhibit cyclooxygenase and 5-lipoxygenase?
Because it's not always enough. Sometimes we come into the picture when it's too late, or when we want to go more upstream than that and inhibit inflammation. Not just the steroids do not only inhibit here. I'm not going to go into this now, but this is the pathway of our arachidonic acid pathway. But I just told you that there's like 180 mediators of inflammation. Steroids have a lot of other anti-inflammatory effects. They have effects on T cells, they have effect on production of cytokines, they have effect on the production of COX-2 itself, which is why, it's like a more like a nuclear weapon, or, like a slingshot.
Right.
So you don't go directly there, and you only use it if you have to, because it has a lot of side effects. Because what we use, I'll just give you one example. We use, I'm talking to you.
Oh, sorry.
We use corticosteroids to inhibit, and corticosteroids are also involved in all the liquid metabolism and adrenal functions. So when people take steroids, what do we see? What happens to them? They swell, yeah, because we also interfere with with a lot of other things. So because it's so pleiotropic, we try not to do it if we have to. Except sometimes we can do topical or local steroids. Like some steroids come as an ointment, or some people that have asthma can take steroids by inhalation, and then the concentrations are such that it's only local and it doesn't have systemic effects. Okay, platelet activating factor, another cell-derived mediator. This is just to show you that it's also derived, it's also produced by phospholipase C, and it can have effects on neutrophils and activation of neutrophils and macrophages, effects on the vasculature. This is just listing all the effects on activation of platelets, and it's a lot more potent than histamine. So the beginning is histamine, but when the mediators that come later on are actually a lot more potent than the initial response. We talked about cytokines. They're produced by many cells, not just during inflammation. They're very important in acute inflammation, and the major ones are interleukin-1, that is involved in the activation of endothelial cells and leukocytes, but also in the systemic acute phase response. Interleukin-6 that mediates some of the systemic effects, mainly fever, and TNF-alpha that, like interleukin-1, stimulates the expression of adhesion molecules on endothelial cells. Also, colony-stimulating factors. Why are they important?
Increased neutrophil production?
Hmm?
Increased neutrophil production?
Exactly. So the first leukocytes that will get to the site of inflammation are from the reservoirs in the bone marrow or in the blood. But later on, we need to produce more. So the signal of colony-stimulating factors will cause the increased production of leukocytes in the bone marrow to cover the demands of the tissue. Chemokines, we also discussed, they are part of the recruitment and the ability of leukocytes to get to where they are needed. We talked about this in length. In immunology, this is a really good summary slide of the two main cytokines of acute inflammation, TNF and IL-1, and their different local and systemic effects. So, in the beginning of this lesson, someone asked me about nitric oxide, so we're going to talk about it now. It's actually a soluble gas, and it's expressed by endothelial cells and by macrophages. And the half-life of it is seconds, so it has to act either in an autocrine or in a paracrine manner, because within seconds it's gone. It's formed by nitric oxide synthase, and there's two of them. One is called enos. It's constitutively expressed in endothelial cells. And one is called inos. It's inducible only following stimulation, and this is responsible for the production of NO in macrophages. And not surprisingly, cytokines will induce inos, such as TNF. For example, cytokine TNF will induce the production of an inos, causing the release of nitric oxide. And like many other mediators, it has different roles. It can be a potent vasodilator, but can also be an inhibitor of inflammation depending on the context. And this is how it looks. So endothelial cells can produce nitric oxide, which will affect which cells? And it's actually the vascular smooth muscle cells, right? It causes relaxation and vasodilation. So endothelial cells will produce it, and it will affect the close by smooth muscle cells. Macrophages that are activated will produce nitric oxide, first of all, for killing. I don't know if you remember, we talked about it in inflammation, about the killing pathway, and nitric oxide is part of the killing mechanism, but some of it will also be secreted and will also affect the smooth muscle cells. So activated macrophages and endothelial cells. Reactive oxygen species are also produced in the intracellular effect of effort of killing pathogens and phagocytose the microbe, but they can also be released from activated leukocytes. Low levels can actually increase the expression of chemokines and cytokines and adhesion molecules, so actually be pro-inflammatory mediators. But at higher levels, what we get is tissue damage, which is part of the reason that prolonged inflammation will cause tissue damage. They're inactivated by antioxidants that scavenge them. Pain, another hallmark of inflammation. It's actually a protective mechanism with very clear survival value. If we didn't have pain, we just put our hand in fire or anything else without feeling the tissue damage. So it's basically a mechanism that is a link between the organic and the conscious. It's a signal for us that something is wrong, that we should do something about it. Sensory nerves are obviously important in localizing the pain, so that we know that the pain is in our hand. And actually, infections that do not involve pain are more dangerous because we know that something is wrong much later. For example, diabetic patients that have problems in their sensory nerves, at the ending of their nerves, sometimes have wounds that are, for example, in their feet, and they don't feel the pain. And so they don't see them on time, and by the time they get to the doctor with the wound, it's already in a very bad shape, which they would feel if the sensory mechanism was intact. So pain is, in a way, our friend. Exaggerated. So just to summarize the different phases of acute inflammation, they actually overlap. Edema can happen within minutes, also followed by the recruitment of polymorph nuclears, and then monocytes and macrophages. Later on, the process of tissue repair will start, where fibroblasts are the star cells. We're going to talk about that on Sunday. Inflammation needs to be actively terminated to eliminate or to minimize the bystander damage to the tissues. So it has to be declined by different mechanisms. One is, we mentioned already that a lot of the mediators have a very short half-life. So if there's not stimulus that will cause more production of them, then there will be decline just because they're being either degraded or actively degraded after their release. Neutrophils, so some of the cells that are important in acute inflammation, also have a short half-life. How long do neutrophils live?
24 hours.
After they live, the vessels, so no, 6 to 8 hours. And then they're gone, yeah. The apoptose.
Yeah.
And there's also a lot of active stop signals. For example, we talked about the arachidonic acid derivatives. Some of them are activators, such as leukotrienes, but some of them are inhibitors, such as lipoxins. So anti-inflammatory mediators start being produced, such as TGF-beta and IL-10, which are cytokines that are anti-inflammatory. Another set of molecules that are called resolvins and protectins that are also mediators that actively terminate inflammation. Some of the mediators just decay, such as arachidonic acid metabolites. Some of them are actively inactivated by enzymes, such as bradykinin, which I mentioned that after a few minutes it's actively degraded by another enzyme. Some are scavenged, so macrophages can scavenge reactive oxygen species in the tissue. Some are actively inhibited. And this normally causes this. So the red ones are pro-inflammatory mediators, the green ones are anti-inflammatory, and gradually, if the stimulus is gone, so if we kill the bacteria, for example, then this will happen. Gradually, there's going to be more anti-inflammatory signals, decay and degradation of the pro-inflammatory, and resolution. Whereas if things go wrong, either because we did not eradicate the stimulus or because something in the regulation goes wrong, this never ends, and we get
Chronic
inflammation. Exactly. So this is basically everything we just said, with a little extra. So acute inflammation can end with complete resolution, everything is well and goes back to place, or healing with fibrosis. In other words, the inflammation ends, but the tissue damage will leave some kind of scar. The tissue will not get back to exactly the way it was, and we're going to talk about that on Sunday. This happens when there's a lot of tissue damage that just doesn't enable complete resolution, or in certain tissues that have no regenerative activity, and there's always going to, for example, in the heart tissue, when there's a myocardial infarct, there will always be fibrosis, always healing because the cells are incapable of proliferating. Or if within the exudate, we talked about exudate, right? Exudate or exudate? Exudate. Date. So within the, because in Hebrew you would say exudate. So within the exudate, there's also fibrin, and if there's a large, if there's a big amount of fibrin in the exudate, it is not readily cleared, and it will cause also healing with fibrosis. We're going to see pictures of that, maybe today, but probably on Sunday.
What's exudate again?
What? Who wants to say what exudate is?
No cells. Oh,
No,
no,
there are cells.
It's the edema liquid. It's an inflammatory edema liquid that contains protein and debris and cells. As opposed to
Plasma.
transudate, which is basically just plasma resulting from differences in hydrostatic or oncostatic pressure. Okay, so inflammation, exudate. And another possible outcome is the progression to chronic inflammation. What are the factors that determine the different outcome? First of all, it's the virulence and the type of agent. Some agents will cause chronic inflammation. And the host response, again, depending on the immune status of the host, and the severity and location of the lesion. In different tissues, we're going to get more readily, there'll be more tendency for healing and fibrosis, and in other tissues, they have more regenerative capacity, like, for example, the skin versus the heart. And this is also a good graphic summary of the different courses and outcomes. So we can have the injury that can be either bacterial infection or some kind of mechanical trauma causing acute inflammation. Acute inflammation can result eventually in complete resolution, back to normal, or there's going to be an abscess formation with a lot of pus, and this can never be completely resolved. So we will have the inflammation will stop, but we're going to have some kind of fibrosis and scar, or it can progress to chronic inflammation. And some injuries will immediately cause chronic inflammation, not even going through acute inflammation. Okay? So this is just a summary of the differences. This is just a summary of different highlights about acute inflammation. It's a defensive host response. It's amplified, lots of mediators. It persists until the stimulus is removed and the mediators are inhibited or degraded. Inflammation is potentially dangerous, needs to be very strictly regulated. And that's about it. And we're going to start now talking about chronic inflammation. And also, probably the morphology we're only going to do on Sunday. So, the definition of chronic inflammation is inflammation of prolonged duration, okay? So acute inflammation usually takes a few days. Chronic inflammation usually takes weeks or months or even years. What we see in chronic inflammation are three different things, three signs. First of all, it's active inflammation. There's a lot of tissue destruction and also attempts of repair. What can be the causes of chronic inflammation? Some infections by microorganisms are persistent and difficult to eradicate, and they will cause chronic inflammation. For example, mycobacteria that causes tuberculosis will cause, different mycobacteria will cause chronic inflammation. Some viruses, some parasites, and some organisms immediately cause signs of chronic inflammation, such as syphilis, for example. Toxic agents can also be the cause of chronic inflammation. For example, chronic exposure to silica, which will cause silicosis, so chronic inflammation of the lungs caused by the exposure to this. There's also, there can also be a physiological chronic inflammation by exposure of blood vessels to VLDLs, okay, so very low density which will cause atherosclerosis, which is basically chronic inflammation of the blood vessels. Autoimmunity diseases also have features of chronic inflammation. There's chronic inflammatory diseases of the digestive system, such as Crohn's disease. There's rheumatoid arthritis, systemic lupus erythematosus, so autoimmune diseases that will have features of chronic inflammation. And asthma and allergies have mixed features of both acute and chronic inflammation. So what are the morphological features that, if we're a pathologist and we're looking at tissue section, and we have to say, is this acute or chronic inflammation? The first thing that we're going to look at is the type of cells that we're going to see there. If we see mostly neutrophils, we're going to guess that this is acute. And if we see a lot of macrophages, lymphocytes, and plasma cells, we're going to think that this is a chronic inflammation. Another sign is tissue destruction, and also signs of fibrosis and angiogenesis. So for example, in this lung section, I'm not expecting you to be a pathologist, but if you were, you would see that there's a large accumulation of immune cells here, collection of inflammatory cells that you don't see in a normal tissue, and a lot of them are lymphocytes. And there's also a lot of collagen deposition, which is a sign of fibrosis. So the normal connective tissue is gradually replaced by fibrotic tissue if the inflammation is chronic, and also changes to the parenchyma, to the functional cells of this tissue. And macrophages that are so important in acute inflammation are also major players in chronic inflammation. And similar to what we saw in acute inflammation, they come from the bone marrow, they get to the tissue by the same mechanisms that we have discussed, and there they can either be activated or differentiate to resident macrophages. So this is just showing that they come, what I just said, come from bone marrow, go to the blood, get to the tissue. This whole process of their migration from the bone marrow to the tissue is tightly regulated by different cytokines and chemokines and adhesion molecules. Everything we discussed is also relevant in chronic inflammation. We're going to skip that because it's the same that we talked about. One thing that I want to say is that in chronic inflammation, T cells are also very important, and there's very complex cross interactions between macrophages and T cells. So this is a general scheme that could start from different places, but we see that the macrophages come to the tissue, and in response to cytokines that are secreted by T cells and by other cells, they can differentiate into, they can have like alternative differentiation to macrophages that mediate mostly inflammation and tissue injury, and macrophages that mediate repair. And it's not like a 0-1 thing, it's more like a continuum, but when we isolate macrophages from tissues, we can look at the surface molecules that they express and the cytokines that they express, and we can say which type this is. Did anyone talk to you about Th1, Th2?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is M1 and M2, and it correlates with the Th1 and Th2. So macrophages will differentiate according to the cytokines that are secreted by Th1 cells or Th2 cells to these two features. The reason we see a lot of macrophages in chronically inflamed tissues is because they're recruited, but also they can locally proliferate and be immobilized. So the accumulated effect of these three things is that we get foci of macrophages in chronically inflamed tissues. The recruitment of macrophages is via chemokine. CCL2 is the most known chemoattractant for macrophages, but also C5a of the complement can recruit macrophages, and also fragments of collagen and fibronectin. Why would fragments of extracellular matrix, why does it make sense that fragments of extracellular matrix will recruit or activate macrophages?
Sign of damage.
Exactly, because when there are, it's a sign of tissue damage, so it makes sense. And like other cells that are important in inflammation, macrophages can be very destructive to tissues because they have a huge arsenal of mediators that can also damage the tissues, and this is what we see during chronic inflammation, a lot of tissue damage, for example, by the reactive oxygen species and nitrogen species that they produce, different cytokines and growth factors. They can also be destructive to the extracellular matrix. They release a lot of proteases. So in short-lived inflammation, when the irritant is eliminated, macrophages disappear. Okay, they die off. They find their way into the lymphatics, except for the resident ones, and things go back to normal. But in chronic inflammation, they persist in the tissue because of the recruitment and the other stimulus, and they can cause a lot of tissue damage. Other cells that are found in chronic inflammation are T lymphocytes and plasma cells, but also mast cells and eosinophils, mostly in allergic reactions or asthma that we said are kind of mixed, acute and chronic. So this is a picture that I always wonder if it's real or was it Photoshop. Let's see what we see. What do we see here? What's this? Hmm?
What's
The
This?
Hulk?
No, the bottom is monocyte.
What is this?
Lymphocyte.
Eosinophil.
Lymphocyte.
That's a neutrophil.
It's hard to see.
It's a polymorph nuclear. Look at the nucleus.
Is this supposed to have like 4 nuclei though?
It has a polymorphic nucleus.
Oh.
Okay, that's why they're called polymorphic
Sensitive about
nucleus.
it, okay?
That's a neutrophil. That's like a classic neutrophil. And what's this?
Neutrophil.
That's an eosinophil. How do you know?
There's two.
Another reason, the color, right? It's called an eosinophil because it will have a reddish cytoplasm because it takes up the eosine rather than the hemotoxin in the staining. This,
Basophil.
yeah, and this,
Lymphocyte.
I think this will be like a macrophage, and this will probably be a lymphocyte. But yeah, it's a mononuclear cell.
What's that last one? That's neutrophil too?
No, I think
No.
that's a macrophage.
No, the one you didn't point out.
Yeah, that's a neutrophil. Also like a classic polymorph.
Right.
Nuclear.
They look kind of different.
I'm not sure if it's possible at all to find all of these in one blood smear, but if it is, it's very impressive.
Is that platelet also?
That's small guy.
Maybe I see a lot of red blood cells.
Yeah.
Anyway, what I wanted to say is that lymphocytes are also recruited to the site of inflammation by cytokines that are released by macrophages. for example, different chemokines and cytokines, and they have there's bidirectional interactions between T cells and macrophages. We can start anywhere we want, but let's say, for example, there's already an activated macrophage in the tissue, producing TNF, IL-1, activating the neutrophils, but also it gets to the lymph node, where it presents antigen to T cells, and these T cells in return produce interferon gamma that activates further macrophages, and these T cells can also produce their own cytokines, TNF, IL-17, and recruit more neutrophils and macrophages. So there's bidirectional, multidirectional interactions. Plasma cells, you probably learned about them in immunology. They develop from activated B cells, and they're also found in sites of chronic inflammation. Sometimes in sites of chronic inflammation, the lymphocytes form aggregates that look like almost like a lymph node, and this is another sign of chronically inflamed tissues. They're called tertiary lymphoid organs because they almost look like a lymph node. For example, in rheumatoid arthritis. Mast cells can also participate in chronic inflammation, mostly in allergies and asthma. Same goes for eosinophils. And sometimes we even see neutrophils in chronic inflammation, although they are actually the hallmark of acute inflammation. In some persistent bacterial infection, we'll also see neutrophils. Another hallmark of chronic inflammation is angiogenesis, the production of new blood vessels, which is part of the destruction and repair effort. Is that a question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Would that be related to chronic hives? Or
Sorry,
would
you're
that
going to
be-
have to ask that again.
Would that be related to chronic hives? Like if you have the...
Not sure what chronic hives are.
Okay. Urticaria.
Hmm?
Urticaria.
Sorry.
So allergic reactions, itchy. Look like mosquito bites.
Oh,
kind of.
okay. So are you asking about the neutrophils?
Angiogenesis. It's okay, that's all.
I don't think so.
Alright.
No, the redness that you'll see there is not part of that. Angiogenesis, you'll see it when there's tissue repair. We'll talk about it on Sunday because we're going to talk about wound healing, and angiogenesis is part of wound healing. You know, for example, when you have a skin wound and it has a scab, and then the scab falls off, or you remove it if you're 6 years old, and under it there's like this ping. No?
I still do that.
Okay. You're not supposed to. There's this pink colored tissue.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's called granulation tissue. We're going to talk about it on Sunday, but part of the reason that it's, you know, part of the reason that it looks reddish is the new blood vessels. But in like this skin irritation, no, I don't think so. Okay, so you have here a summary of acute versus chronic inflammation. The causative agent can be different. I couldn't get it straight, this thing. I'm sorry about that. So acute inflammation can be caused by pathogens or by tissue injury. Chronic inflammation can be caused by persistent acute inflammation, but also by different pathogens that cause chronic reactions. The major cells involved in acute inflammation are neutrophils and mononuclear cells, and chronic inflammation we're also going to see lymphocytes, plasma cells, and fibroblasts that are involved in the tissue repair. The onset of acute inflammation is immediate, chronic is delayed. This usually takes a few days, but chronic inflammation can even take years. So some people have chronic inflammatory diseases that they carry throughout life. The outcomes of acute inflammation can either be, as we discussed, can either be resolution, abscess formation, or progress to chronic inflammation. And the outcome of chronic inflammation is always, there's always tissue destruction, sometimes fibrosis and necrosis. There's always tissue damage.
What about chronic inflammation? Is that also part of chronic?
This is wrong. This is a comparison between acute.
No, I'm just saying on the bottom, outcomes chronic inflammation.
Yeah.
So now I realize it's kind of dumb question. Obviously, chronic inflammation has chronic inflammation.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's true. It's true.
Yeah.
So anything that, this is like general pathology, so anything that can go right can also go wrong if there's too little of it or too much of it. So we can have either defective inflammation, which will typically result in increased susceptibility to infections. For example, in immunology course, we talked about syndrome where there's myeloperoxidase deficiency, so the cells cannot kill bacteria, and so these people are more susceptible to infections, or people that have defects in the ability of leukocytes to adhere to blood vessels. So this is defective inflammation. And it will also be associated with delayed wound healing. But we can also have excessive inflammation, which will cause allergies, autoimmune diseases, also neurodegenerative diseases. We now know that they are related to some chronic inflammation, and also cancer. Who can think of an example where chronic inflammation is linked with cancer? Hepatitis, for example, exactly. So yeah, actually 20% or even more of human cancers are related to chronic inflammation that preceded cancer. And how do we know about that? People that took aspirin, there was a huge study that came out in 2011 about people that took aspirin for other reasons, okay? So some people take aspirin regularly, not because of inflammation, but for blood clotting. So there was this huge database, and someone could do a huge retrospective study of the link between people that took non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs, or it was actually specifically aspirin, and death from cancer. And they found these amazing percentages that it reduced the risk of death from cancer. Look, 30% for lung cancer, 40% for colorectal cancer, 60% for esophageal cancer. And we also know that the chances of getting hepatocellular carcinoma are much higher for people with hepatitis. And people that have Crohn's disease or other inflammatory bowel disease have highly increased chances of getting colon cancer. So, yeah.
So do you think aspirin could be used as a sort of preventative measure for cancer?
I always get this question, and I think I never want to answer it, because I think this is something that each person should consult with their physician. Is aspirin good for me? Obviously, for these people that took aspirin, the numbers are clear. It reduces the risk of death from cancer. But this is because these are the two factors that were measured in these people. There's so many other factors for each person. Is it good for you to take aspirin? Is it good for you to take anti-inflammatory drugs chronically?
Right.
Okay, so the question is why? This is something that I can talk about for a lot, because my research is about inflammation and cancer, but I'm going to do it short. So why actually is inflammation pro-tumorigenic? We can take everything we learned and think about it. If we have a tissue where there's inflammation, we have a tissue where there's a lot of secretion of growth factors, because inflammation involves repair, so we have growth factors. But we also have a lot of reactive oxygen species, cytokines and chemokines. So we basically have an environment where epithelial cells will proliferate in an environment where there's higher risk for what causes cancer? Mutations, right? So it's a statistical thing. In order for cancer to occur, we're going to have mutations in genes that are related to growth control, to proliferation, or to cell death. Okay, oncogenes, tumor suppressor genes. So statistically,
But if we have a lot of proliferation, we increase the chance that this happens. And if we have a lot of proliferation in an environment where there's a lot of mutagenic factors, such as reactive oxygen species, again, we increase the chances. Okay? So it's not a 0-1. It just increases the chances of malignancy. Yeah.
Are we talking about this with regard to chronic inflammation just because since it's going on for longer, there's a higher chance of it?
Yes.
And it's not seen in acute inflammation?
No, if you have acute inflammation for 2 days, it's not enough time for all this to occur. Yeah, this has to be for years.
Oh, wow.
Years. It's a slow process. So now, because this is a thought, I'm just looking at how much time we still have. So we're supposed to finish 15, so we have 4 minutes. Okay, so we'll do a little bit. Here comes the part with the beautiful pictures. So the morphologic pattern, just so you can imagine how these things look. You want to be doctors, right? So morphologic patterns of acute and chronic inflammation using everything we talked about. So we talked about exudate. It can either be serous exudate, which we're going to see, or fibrinous exudate. So this will be an exudate that contains a lot of fibrin. We mentioned it because we said it's higher to eradicate, and then we're not going to have complete resolution. There's also pus formation that is called suppurative or purulent inflammation. And sometimes we'll have ulcers that are basically foci of inflammation that are with a lot of cell death that are close to some kind of surface. It can either be inside, so it can be in the digestive system or in the mouth or in the skin. So they have to be near some surface where there's shedding of the dead cells causing loss of tissue. So that's how an ulcer is created. You see beautiful pictures of all that. And also, there's granulomatous inflammation or granulomas. And this is a hallmark of chronic inflammation usually. So we'll start with serous inflammation and then continue on Sunday. So this is like just an inflammatory focus. This is like the most plain type of exudate. I guess the best example for you to think of is a blister. Did anyone ever had a blister that had liquid in it? Right, so that's serous inflammation. It's usually mild inflammation, and it consists of mostly just whatever you find in the serum. Okay, so this happens after burns, sometimes viral infections, and histologically it looks like this. So this is a blister. This is the skin. So we have the epithelial layer. This is just the keratin, epithelial layer, and then the dermis. And here they're separated from each other with a space that is filled with liquid. And this is the serous inflammation. And this is exudate and also inflammatory cells. So this is serous inflammation. And I guess we're going to do fibrinous inflammation on Sunday. Okay? So that's all.
That's all.
Yeah.
Thank you.